Hi, everyone. If you don't mind taking a seat, we're going to start the meeting. So for those who don't know me, my name is Montana Capsule. I am the Town of Cohasset's Resiliency and Grant Coordinator. I was recently hired this past November. I worked with the Harbor Committee for a little bit, AEC, which I'm actually hosting their committee meeting this Thursday. So if I see any of you there, great. But today is about Coastal Zone Management, which is a government agency. We applied for a grant with them back in 2022. Luckily, we are accepted, and we partnered with Woods Hole Group, and they have been conducting climate change vulnerability assessments at Little Harbor, James Brook, all the way downtown. So I will let Nasser take it from here, and he can introduce himself.
Thank you. I'm Nasser Rahim, Senior Climate Resiliency Planner at Woods Hole Group. We're based down in Bourne, Massachusetts. I live in Quincy, so not too far away. Apologies for being late. I had a last minute, I have a 1-year-old in daycare, and so and a 4-year-old in daycare, and so we had a thing that we had to solve quickly as I was about to step out the door. So today we're here talking about a flood vulnerability assessment, and we'll be getting into resiliency strategies. That's also part of this project for Cohasset Cove and the James Brook watershed. As mentioned, this project was partially funded by a coastal resilience grant from the Office of Coastal Zone Management. And the goals of this project are fourfold. So one is to develop an integrated flood risk model that accounts for coastal flooding, inland flooding, and the combination of those two, all of which we know interact in the James Brook watershed. We are in the process of developing that model still. And so the vulnerability assessment that we're presenting on today and the resiliency strategies we work on will be focused on the coastal flooding component. But once those modeling results, once the model is developed and the results of that are available, we'll be cross-checking to see what else can we learn from those results. The second is to assess the vulnerability of public assets for primarily to present and future flooding. So Coastal Zone Management as a government agency is focused on critical infrastructure and assets, as well as natural resources and other assets. So we're not focused so much on private assets in this presentation, but as we'll talk about as a next step, we'll be looking at these resiliency strategies, which would focus on mitigating, reducing the risks that we're going to be talking about today, and those would be to the benefit of many private properties as well. The third goal is to develop strategies to reduce future flooding risks to critical wastewater infrastructure specifically. As you can see on the right-hand side, which you may be familiar with, the wastewater treatment facility and the influent pump station, which handle all the sewage that's piped in the central area of town, are treated and discharged from that location, which is right in Jacobs Meadow. And so we're focused primarily on that critical infrastructure in a greater level of detail. And then we'll be developing resiliency strategies for the region to mitigate risks to critical infrastructure and resources. But I wanted to mention that regional strategies here are strategies that could be implemented in a smaller area that benefit a larger area. So regional here doesn't necessarily mean cross-jurisdictional, doesn't necessarily mean things we can do in Situate or elsewhere to the benefit of this project area. We have already conducted some kickoff meetings and fact-finding meetings. We have been working on the integrated flood model development, collecting all kinds of data on stormwater infrastructure and drainage infrastructure in the watershed. We've conducted the vulnerability assessment and are here to share the results of that and get your feedback on it, as well as we've developed preliminary resiliency options for the wastewater treatment plant, which we'll be updating after this meeting. And here we are at the public meeting. We'll have another task, the regional resiliency strategies, and we'll be back with another public meeting in June. This project builds on a lot of prior initiatives that the town has been leading for many years, going back to the flood control master plan in 2008, improvements at the tide gate and outfall at Jacobs Meadow, a couple of different planning initiatives focused on identifying priorities, what are the most vulnerable areas and what should we do about it, that includes the Municipal Vulnerability Preparedness or MVP plan, as well as the Hazard Mitigation Plan, which is a FEMA plan. And the town's broader initiatives, planning initiatives, the master plan, the municipal harbor plan, and other items as well that are listed here. So we've basically looked at those documents. We've identified, working with the town, even coming up with this project concept, looking at those documents to see where's the focus. That's how we ended up with this project area. And this project is really meant to advance some of those priorities. I realize now I've only been changing slides on one of these sheets. Let's see here. Oop. Okay. We are also building on decisions made about 200 years ago, or maybe longer. This is the oldest historical map I could find of the area from 1831, which is when the decision was first made to put roads and development around a salt marsh. You can see probably some of the first settlements were built up on the highlands around the marsh. But you know, that harbor front and the connection around it has been sort of part of the town's history for many years. And so we're currently living with kind of those decisions and decisions made subsequently to densify development in this area, to change the roadway network, which causes different problems, and also the changing climate, right? So when these patterns of development started and continued for many years, there was no sea level rise. You know, they had a limited sense of what the history of storms might be. And unfortunately now we're dealing with those consequences already, and those consequences are expected to increase in the future, which is a major part of what we're analyzing here as part of this project. So as I mentioned, the climate hazards we're focused on here is overland coastal flooding, and that includes from high tides, from storm surge, and from waves. These will be updated, as I mentioned. The assets are primarily focused on critical infrastructure, and again, primarily public, and the associated services that they provide. But the regional resiliency options we develop will benefit public and private interests. And in terms of geography, we're focused here on the James Brook watershed, and primarily really around the area of Jacobs Meadow and Cohasset Village, where there's a lot of concentration of critical assets and infrastructure. We know that other waterfront areas in town are vulnerable, even just in Cohasset Cove, but then beyond that, Atlantic Ave, other areas. And we know your neighbors, and I've worked for the town of Hingham, the town of Hull. But we also know Situate is vulnerable as well. So there's a lot of things to plan and actions that might be needed in the future. And the town is, as you have seen, has been focused on this issue for quite some time, and presumably will be moving forward with other projects in the future. So the basis of our overland coastal flood analysis is the Massachusetts Coast Flood Risk Model, or MCFRM. If you want an acronym to remember, that's a good one, MCFRM. This is now the state standard tool for assessing vulnerability and risk of communities, et cetera, to future coastal flooding from sea level rise and climate change. It is incorporated in the state's climate resilient design standards and guidelines. It is even used in regulatory processes in the state. It takes into account all the things you could imagine. So the inputs include sea level rise. We run sea level rise dynamically. So we run future tides with higher sea levels. So we're not just taking the tide today and adding a certain number of feet of sea level rise. We actually run the tidal constituents, the currents, et cetera, and see how those change the effects locally in different communities. We run both tropical storms, which including hurricanes, as well as nor'easters, which are important. Some initiatives, some mapping initiatives previously, like from the Army Corps of Engineers, just look at hurricanes. We obviously have more risk from nor'easters currently, but in the future, we incorporate a changing climate. So in the future, we incorporate an increase in tropical storms, and particularly large ones. So that kind of changes the dynamics of what kinds of events we're at risk from. incorporates the landscape, the elevations, et cetera. And it's run through this probabilistic hydrodynamic model, which is a physics-based model. It calculates where water wants to flow, its speed, its velocity, how high the water gets, et cetera, how long it stays in a given location. So the outputs will be focused primarily in this presentation on flood probability and also flood depth, but there's quite a number of other outputs from this data, which can be used for project-specific design or planning initiatives. In terms of what sea level is included in the model, the numbers are shown here. So our baseline for present day, the way that tides are usually calculated, tidal datum are usually calculated is over a 19-year period, because there's a natural cycle of the sun, moon, and star, the sun, moon, and stars, sun, moon, and earth, and how they interact to affect tides. So you have to take kind of an average period and look at that. So historically, our baseline is the period from 1999 to 2017, the midpoint of which is 2008. And then to that, we have sea level rise of 1.3 feet by 2030, 2.5 feet by 2050, and 4.3 feet by 2070. Those numbers are based on the state's most recent updated probabilistic sea level rise projections. They have a very low probability of being exceeded. So we're planning for something that is very unlikely. It's very unlikely for it to be worse than what we're planning for, which means it's likely to be better. We took a look at the other sea level rise estimates from the state. So the state also provides at the low end an intermediate level of sea level rise. And what we see here is that our 2030 estimates could occur as late as 2050 under an intermediate projection, that our 2050 numbers could be more like 2070, and our 2070 numbers could be more like 2100. What exactly the numbers fall out to be will depend on how much carbon emissions and greenhouse gas emissions we put into the atmosphere, and how negatively the atmosphere, the Earth systems respond to those emissions. So the benefit of planning for a bad case scenario is that if things take longer to get bad, then we can shift our timeline either for action or for when we need to do something else, as we're planning to maybe adapt incrementally as these things happen over time. We want to make sure that we're taking observations into account in that process. And so the numbers, the mapping I'll show you is not happy. It's not a pretty story. I'm the bearer of bad news today, but I can actually say that the news could be worse. That's my tagline. Yes, question from the audience.
So is that 1.3 feet from 2017?
From 2008.
From 2008?
Yeah.
So how much has it risen since 2008?
Well, you can see that our 2020, we have observations from the Boston Harbor tide gauge through 2020. We actually have them obviously beyond that, but what's shown here is 2020. So you can see that we're below the high curve right now, which hopefully that trend continues. We're following pretty closely to the intermediate high and the intermediate curve. Yes.
When was this risk model defined, and who is sort of the authority for the risk model?
Yeah, so Woods Hole Group developed the model. Initially, we had developed a previous version of this model for Mass DOT with some funding from the Federal Highway Administration. Their intention was to look at the central artery tunnel system, the Big Dig, right? All that stuff is underground. And so the real interest was in understanding the risk to that system over time. Now, once that model was developed, neighboring communities, the state, were all interested in getting this data and at a same level of specificity for their communities. And so the state invested in expanding it statewide. It was also Mass DOT was the leader initially, and then the state's Office of Energy and Environmental Affairs, EEA, invested as well significantly in expanding it so that it can be used by any member of the public to go online, put in your address of a project that you're planning to develop, and get back numbers and maps that show you what is the risk of this site in the future, what elevations should you consider designing to in the future. So all that actually has been done now. So it took quite a few years to kind of refine the products to make them as useful for everybody who's designing anything or evaluating assets as possible. And coastal zone management was involved along the whole way, including in trying to figure out what sea level rise numbers to use and what those products could look like. It's evolved, so it continues to evolve, and it's been built upon, I guess the model is being now expanded. So New Hampshire and Maine are both we're currently developing the same, essentially the same system for those communities as well. It was developed with a lot of input from a lot of academic stakeholders, technical users, state specialists, et cetera. Yes.
So that we can calibrate what you mean by sea level
Mhm.
and by our tide datum, which is mean lower low water. Could you explain to us what we're looking at here?
Sure.
Is this truly sea level? With mean lower low water below that dotted line?
Yeah, this is the mean sea level, particularly at the Boston tide gauge location. And our model has slightly different, different numbers for Cohasset
That's
Harbor.
Roughly 5 feet above mean lower low water.
Approximately, yes. Yeah, and we actually have a slide later that shows what are the future tidal datum, what's the difference look like in the future. So all the numbers I'm going to be showing, if it's an elevation, are going to be in the datum feet NAVD 88, which is the North American vertical datum of 1988. And it's what you see in your FEMA maps, for example, as the base flood elevation. It is the same datum. It's kind of like the national standard, which is why we use it for land-based activity. A lot of maritime users use mean low water or mean lower low water. More slides on tidal datum in the future. I'm going to skip this slide just for time, but it was basically just reiterating that we took into account future climate during, in which we expect storm surge to increase because the storms will be bigger. And then just reiterating that we evaluated both nor'easters and tropical cyclones. So this unfortunately was one of those animated slides that due to our technical issues here doesn't show, but it's still, this is basically showing you the mesh of this grid. So each of these little dots represents a place where the model is making calculations. And as we move further out into the ocean, it includes the entire Atlantic Ocean, but as we get further out into the ocean, those dots get further apart because we don't need to know the minute differences between them. As we get closer to land, where one building is here, another building is here, those dots get a lot closer. But they're still not, a foot apart, right? So there still is some resolution that we might like to have a greater resolution, but at this stage, once you get into project design, maybe you'll use a higher resolution model, but maybe not. This is still a really great planning tool. So you can see what the resolution looks like in the lower James Brook watershed here. This is Summer Street, I believe, or sorry, South Main Street. No, this is South Main Street. This is the commuter rail, and Elm Street is probably right around here. We also know, again, as I mentioned, that there is underground drainage infrastructure in the James Brook watershed that connects Jacobs Meadow to areas further upstream. These are kind of roughly showing those locations, but as I mentioned, we've had a team out there surveying this infrastructure and reviewing engineering plans. As I mentioned, the model itself doesn't include this underground infrastructure. If we tried to do that for the whole state, we'd still be working on it. Risks that are shown in the maps that I'll show you, and risks in terms of risks to assets that I show you that are kind of west of South Main Street may be underrepresented. And that's the case until we get way out there into the future where water levels are so high that what you see is more or less what you get. But I'll highlight those when they get the chance. In the meantime, expect to see a little flag kind of indicating that there's maybe underrepresented risks on the other side. So I'm going to go through a series of maps. The first set will focus on the probability of flooding. That's one of the great outputs from this model, is it shows you, instead of just seeing a 100-year flood and it covers everything, it doesn't give you that opportunity to look at, well, what's more at risk. And How does that change over time? So this model gives you everything from the dark blue, which is on the right side of the, maybe I can hide this. I don't know if I can. Nope. Let me see if I can move it. That's better. That's a better location. The dark blue is 100% annual probability. So that means you'd expect this to happen at least once every year. On the far left-hand side is the 0.1% probability. That's about 1 in 1,000 or 1,000-year scenario. And the green is light green is a 1%. That's about 100 year, what you're typically known as the 100-year scenario. The purple is a 10%. So it's a 10-year scenario, something you expect to happen one every 10 years. You may notice that our map for the 1% looks different from your FEMA maps. That's because we're using a different set of tools. We would argue that they're better than what FEMA does. FEMA does what it does. They map the way they map nationwide. So their methodology is meant to be scalable, replicated across the entire country. They don't, the computational resources, the computers you need to make these types of maps are very large and important, large and expensive. They also only use one particular event, not running thousands of storms and doing the statistics to figure out what's actually the 1% chance event. So there's a variety of differences. All of our maps that we show here are using the same methodology. So I think that's an important thing to mention. So as you can see here, oh yeah, go ahead.
So these maps are only, this map you have up here is only seawater intrusion into the meadows. It doesn't include any complications of upland freshwater
Exactly.
finding its way into the same.
Yes, it will. Well, we're developing. I mentioned a higher resolution model that you could use so we're developing that higher resolution model for this project area. It's just the schedule, the timing didn't work out to be able to do it before we did this vulnerability assessment. So we went forward with what we have, which is really great coastal flood risk data and gives you a partial picture, but doesn't tell the whole story.
This is just sea level rise. This doesn't include storm surge and all that other stuff.
It does include storm surge. Yeah. So this is basically the future of coastal storm flood risks. Right, it's from overland flooding, water coming from Cohasset Cove and the harbor and from the Gulf River and going overland and flooding areas. So, yes.
Just so to clarify, there will be a stormwater runoff layer that you'll have available in June or so.
It'll be probably post-June. By June, we hope to have the model fully developed and calibrated and tested, and then we'll probably be generating maps that are similar, like have the same kind of probabilistic methodology that incorporate both sea level and precipitation. So we'll have a precipitation probably alone. We'll incorporate sea level rise alone to say, how does this worsen just with sea level rise? And then we'll probably do some scenarios where there's both coastal storm flooding and rainfall flooding. The thing is that when you have a really big coastal storm and you get a ton of storm surge, it sort of doesn't even matter what happens with rainfall. As long as that coastal flooding is reaching that area, it's probably going to be higher, right? So when we may not run 2070 1% storm, coastal storm with a 2070 1% rainfall, just because we know the coastal storm is going to dominate those impacts. But yes, we'll have that information in the future.
Great.
I'm not monitoring the online chat, but we will get to a point where we hit a question slide. So you can see here, there's about a 2% or 50-year chance of overland flooding that goes over Summer Street and then affects a variety of areas. And then bigger storms can have more impact. As we move to 2030, you can see that probability jumps to about a 20% or once in every 5 years. Not to say that everything is impacted at that level, but that's when water starts to come in. And then as storms become more extreme, as water levels go higher, you start to see a bigger impact. We'll go into more detailed vulnerability assessment results. So I'm kind of just showing you the big picture flooding impacts. I should also have mentioned previously that the left-hand side shows the kind of broader surrounding area, and the lower watershed, which is where we have greater confidence in this information because the underground and great drainage infrastructure doesn't matter as much, is shown on the right-hand side. And this is, did I jump forward or not? Okay, sorry. This is the 2030 results, and here you can see that change in color from, again, the 2% to 20%. So that's a step change in risk from a 50-year to a 5-year of water coming over. And then you can see, pretty significant risks at the 1% level, the green, the light green again. As we move to 2050, it's another step change. So you can see here now that we're dealing with an annual probability of flooding going over both Summer Street and South Main Street. 50-year along Elm Street, or sorry, 50% chance once every 2 years on the other locations. And then once we get to 2070, the annual probability of flooding in this area is quite significant. So that 4.3 feet of sea level rise is really a huge impact. Yes.
So can you go back 2 slides, please?
Yes.
So in this particular scenario, it looks like the 20% scenario is mostly driven by water coming from the Gulf as opposed to reaching the end of the cove. Is that correct?
Yeah,
correct?
that is correct. Yeah. Well, one of the interesting things we found is that, and we'll go into this later, is that flood pathway is a higher priority, is a more likely place for water to come over than Elm Street, Summer Street, the waterfront area in this area. Now, if you look at Margin Street, just outside the watershed boundary, but obviously part of the neighborhood, you can see that is vulnerable. So that roadway network area is going to be impacted. Border Street, same thing.
Yeah.
But that particular section of it is high relative to other areas. And also the seawall there is at about elevation 9 on the top of the seawall. And that's a factor as well. But in the vulnerability assessment, I mentioned, I'll talk about that section a little bit more. We don't expect it to be dry in these types of big storm events, even in this time horizon, because waves are a foot higher than the water level. So you're going to have waves that go over the seawall and, send water across the street. But it's not going to be sort of a full inundation in that same way. All right. So the next set of maps are flood depth maps, and this was supposed to be animated so that you would be able to see the rest of the lower watershed, but you can still see it on the left-hand side here. And apologies for the missing colors here are 0.5 feet. So it's 1 feet is the orange color. That's what's missing from this image. But this is showing you that 100-year, that 1% annual chance event in present day. And so you can see that the flood depths at that location on Summer Street are not terribly deep. So, maybe around half a foot to a foot. As you move forward to 2030, again, that 1% flood levels, that flood depth increases to maybe around 2.5 feet or so. And then you start to get similar flood depths on the waterfront area we're just talking about, right at Cohasset Cove. And flood depths on South Main Street could be particularly high, even reaching 3.5 feet or so. Just a little bit covered by the label. As we move to 2050, you can start to see that the flood depths in the upper part of the watershed in the Cohasset Village area. Flood depths on those roads are even higher now. We're talking about 4.5 feet to 5 feet in some places. And in 2070, as you can expect, we have flooding over 5 feet, on most of the Jacobs Meadow surrounding roadways in this very extreme event in the future, and impacts along the commuter rail and further upstream as well. So I'll just pause for any questions on the flood maps before I go into some more detailed kind of vulnerability assessment information. And I guess, should I check online to see if they're...
Doesn't have a short works, but people want to raise their hand, we can see.
Is anybody online, raise your hand, if you'd like to ask a question?
Looks like you're good right now.
Okay. I hear some rumblings of questions in the back. Any questions for us?
I wondered if this presentation would be available online.
Yes, as a PDF and also as a recording.
Thank you.
I'll send it to all of you who are on the email chain, and I'll be on Cohasset 143, and then Justin will send it out on Monday's last email.
Very,
Yeah.
All right, so the next part of this presentation is going to be talking about those critical assets that are at risk in these different scenarios and kind of what that means. And so I'll present kind of similar maps for those different time horizons and highlight impacts at a couple of different probability levels. I'm not going to go through every single asset at what's the first point at which it's vulnerable, but I'm going to just generally talk about in a up to a 10-year storm or a 10% annual chance flood level, what would be impacted, and then in a 100-year or 1% annual chance, what's impacted. So you can kind of see as we scale through what the impacts would be for different assets. So here's an overview of present day risk to critical facilities and roadways. This is kind of a map that you'll see recurring. I'm going to go into detail, but first I want to, because we focused a little bit more on wastewater, I wanted to start with a different map that looks at wastewater. So in a present day 1% annual chance flood, there would be significant inflow of seawater into the wastewater system from flooded sewer manholes in Jacobs Meadow and low-lying streets. And a particular concern are the ones located in Jacobs Meadow. This is a photo of one of those that's right by the treatment plant and relatively new, but some of them are extremely old. And so they are not watertight. And these trunk lines, you can kind of see here, the orange ones in the middle here. There's 3 trunk lines, basically 1, 2, and then 3 that carry all the sewer from the central area of Cohasset to the treatment plant, well, to a pump station first and then through the treatment plant. And so because it's so close to the action, all that seawater coming into the system would really negatively impact the wastewater treatment's processes, which make it so that the water that comes out the other end is clean. And it would also, recovery from those impacts could be both costly and last for an extended period of time. And in addition to that, for just, the other facilities and private properties around the area, there could be sewage backups into buildings, particularly low-lying buildings or basements where there's not a sewer overflow preventer installed already. In addition to that, access to the wastewater treatment plant and the influent pump station would be temporarily flooded, limiting the ability of operators to manage those types of impacts in real time. One of the things that they might do in a very significant wet weather event is to bypass the treatment plant. So there's the ability to basically send out wastewater untreated, into to the discharge point, which is offshore. And you would do something like that to save the treatment plant processes so that you can start back up and running with treatment once the event is over. But if you can't get there, you can't do those types of things. And so thankfully the sewer operator and the DPW are very attentive and attuned to flooding issues. And so they would likely be there. Someone would likely be there to do that, but access could be an issue if they're not, if there's a surprise event.
So the overflow would go to Hull.
No, this is
not into Cohasset Cove or the current outflow.
not in this scenario. They might try to divert some flow to Hull.
Well, it's the only place it can go at the moment, other than Cohasset Cove.
Cohasset Cove is where I was saying.
You were suggesting.
Yeah, I was
that,
suggesting
So we have overflow into Cohasset Cove.
Yes, yeah. I mean, in an extreme event where you're trying to save, the ability to clean sewage for the weeks that follow, that might be a cost benefit decision you have to make. Not a fun one, but one that is permitted under emergency actions and one that, there's a system in place to do so. There's a a switch to hit or a lever to pull to make that happen if needed. Not anybody's first choice.
Just
Yes,
to be clear, when we're saying that, that's like right in front of Asset Wharf and Atlantica, that's what you mean by where the outflow is?
well, I don't actually know where the discharge pipe ends. Does anybody in the room?
that's
Or
where
that's
it
where it
is.
ends. Yeah, so yeah,
Okay, just right there.
right there.
Okay.
So in terms of transportation impacts, Summer Street and a portion of South Main Street would also be temporarily blocked by flooding. And because the flood depth wouldn't be so crazy, it would probably just cause traffic delays and detours, but it would isolate certain properties and also it would impede emergency response, right? So here's an example from Summer Street during the flood of record, which was March in 2018 for this area, from what we can tell. And you can see the roadway. It's actually from it's actually from Summer Street, the access to a private property here, but you can see that there's already a little bit of water, probably something someone could drive through. But when it's seawater, that has an impact on vehicles as well. It's not good to do, and it's generally unsafe. That's why I say don't drown, turn around when you have a flooded roadway. And the DPW currently blocks, and working with police and emergency response, they currently block roads with barriers when there's flooding, like up at Margin Street or elsewhere, when they know it's going to come. Emergency response is a major impact from the flooded roadways. I know that it's really difficult for them to access parts of the community. Margin Street, I mentioned previously, is highly vulnerable with potentially Summer Street in different places, and maybe even Elm Street from waves or from a slightly more extreme event makes it very hard to reach the south and eastern portions of town from the police and fire headquarters on Elm Street. So yeah, in addition, I've highlighted here Elm Street, right at Cohasset Cove, because I think, based on the waves that we see in the model, that it's likely that there would be, wave overtopping in that area, which could also impact the ability to use that area. And seawalls along the harbor that are in poor condition could also be impacted in such an extreme event. Yes.
Can you take the dialogue box from the chat and pull that down to the bottom because it's covering?
Yes, good idea.
Yeah.
Yeah, I just click on it and drag it in.
Great, thank you.
No problem. Great. So that's showing currently as a up to a 0.1%. So between 1%, bigger than a 1%, smaller than a 0.1%, smaller than a 1,000-year storm. Okay, so as we move, in addition, St. Anthony's Parish House, which serves as a place of assembly, would also be exposed to flooding. So this is an example of not a public asset, but that it is included in the town's hazard mitigation plan, which considers different things like even a hotel, right? A hotel might be important for housing people after an event, or housing emergency responders that come in to help with recovery. Places of assembly might be important. And large places with large gathering areas might be important for, not to get too morose, but things like a temporary morgue, right? Or setting up temporary shelters and things like that. So this is one of those assets that was part of that group of assets listed. So those are kind of the present day risks for this watershed area. So I wondered if wanted to pause for any comments before I move on to the worser parts of this story. Yes.
Just out of curiosity, you mentioned that March of 2018 is the flood of record.
Yeah,
Do we
I
know
probably
that-
I probably overextended myself there, but it was among the January 2018 storm reached higher surge levels in Boston Harbor. I haven't evaluated specifically for Cohasset whether the January storm was bigger than March, but March storm brought a lot of waves. So some communities that were impacted by waves were more impacted by the March.
So my question is, what was that water level elevation, either above sea level or above lower water?
In Boston Harbor, I believe it was around 8.5. And then the January, or maybe a little, actually,
8.5
no, maybe
above sea level.
Yeah, it may have been. Yeah, I know that the January storm was like 9.7 almost. So.
So on a topographical map, looking at Summer Street there, the elevation of Summer Street would be around 8 feet.
Close to 8.5,
Okay.
yeah, it's around,
Just
it's
to
in that
get a
ballpark.
reference. Thank
Yeah. All right, well, I don't know, I guess maybe if folks are online, if you want to just unmute yourself and if you speak over each other, be courteous, but feel free to open your mic and ask any questions. I'll give a couple seconds before I move on. Is Michelle Leary me?
Yes.
Okay.
Make sure that my volume is on, it might be turned off.
No,
Okay.
it's on. Okay. Hearing none. We shall move on. Okay, so these are sort of the vulnerability results for 2030. And I think one thing that stands out is that the 2030 10% flood shown in red sort of would cause similar but slightly worse impacts to wastewater, transportation, public safety, waterfront, et cetera, as just described for the present day 1% event. So the impacts that we might think are quite in a very rare event currently become somewhat commonplace once every 10 years on average, something you would expect to see living in Cohasset, for a long time. In addition to the assets described previously, the food pantry across from St. Anthony's Church would also be exposed to flooding. In a 2030 1% flood, again, more extreme, shown in orange, this would cause significantly greater impacts. At the wastewater treatment facility, there's electrical distribution equipment that you can see on the right side of this picture that is quite low relative to the emergency generator on the left and the pump station in the back. And we anticipate that electrical equipment would flood, which would require the systems at the plant and the pump station to run on emergency power until repairs are made. And if it flooded enough, which I don't think it does in this particular scenario, we wouldn't even necessarily be able to switch to emergency power because the switch for that transition is on that unit. The switches themselves are relatively high up on the unit, a few feet above the top of that concrete pad. The transformer, which is in the middle, which is where the feed from the grid power comes in, is in the middle and it goes all the way down to the bottom. So more risk there. The seawater inflow to the wastewater system here would likely be overwhelming. So we'd be in that same kind of scenario. And while the wastewater treatment plant buildings themselves, not the pump station, but the wastewater treatment plant buildings would flood, we don't think that the elevations would be high enough to enter into the tanks or damage the critical equipment that's there. So it could theoretically come back online afterwards without as much impact. So that's good news. In addition, we can see that the roadway flooding would be pretty extensive. Large sections of Elm, Margin, Border, Summer Street, South Main Streets inaccessible until flooding recedes. And in this case, the greater depth of flooding and the greater duration of flooding, the greater velocity of flooding could cause structural damage to roads. And that would require emergency repairs and reconstruction, maybe potentially after the fact. And those construction impacts would also impact traffic and access in the recovery period that follows the event. But these are all the most direct routes south and east from the police station and the fire department. And we see that as a pretty significant impact for emergency response. In addition to obviously commerce and the other reasons why people need to use roads. In addition, St. Anthony's Church itself and the Red Lion Inn, which could be, as I mentioned, a resource for housing people whose homes were damaged or recovery staff would be exposed to flooding. Any questions on those impacts?
I guess
Yes.
just looking back at that map, it doesn't look like the village, am I mistaken? The village is not getting inundated in that scenario?
Right, it's not being impacted by overland coastal flooding coming from the ocean. So what we don't know is whether flooding that would go through that drainage infrastructure and come out the other side would bring water in from the other side. And that's something that we'll be able to evaluate better with the integrated flood model. So some caution is warranted there. Yeah. Any questions online? If so, please unmute and speak up. All right. Moving on to 2050. Again, in the 2050, 10% flood. It would cause similar impacts on wastewater infrastructure, transportation, public safety, et cetera, as the 2030 1% flood. In addition, we see that flooding could begin to directly impact Cohasset Village crossing Brook Street, although it's fairly minor here. Shown in greater details in the maps. The significant change in 2050 is that the pumping station and the treatment facility would be significantly impacted. So the emergency generator, the pump station that we showed in the previous picture, the wastewater treatment facility would all be inundated to a depth where a lot of critical infrastructure would be damaged. There'd be basically catastrophic damage to key critical equipment and mechanical systems, and also water flowing into the tanks, which could then bring out sewage out of the tanks and have negative impacts on the process as well. So with no influent pumping, there would be nowhere for sewage to go. And there could be quite a lot of backups into buildings, which could be extensive. They would need a temporary kind of pumping and treatment solution. So some kind of emergency response. And then significant follow-up investments in recovering the function of the facility. So I sadly have seen other treatment facilities with much higher vulnerability much sooner. The town of Hull has been working with coastal zone management and now pursuing FEMA funding for major upgrades that would protect their facility in very extreme events like this, although they still have to deal with the issues of inflow that we talked about here, water going in through sewers or even through people's toilets and sinks, et cetera. So, communities are making investments in hardening these types of facilities, and some of them are really needed a lot sooner. So although it sounds very bad, it's positive that it's not a very, very near-term concern that kind of damage could be impacting the facility. Roadway damage in this scenario would also likely be extensive, particularly around Jacobs Meadow. For the issues I previously mentioned, higher flood depths, faster velocities, potentially wave energy. And with greater certainty here, we can say that a 1% flood in 2050 would be high enough to cause extensive flooding between Main Street and Cushing Street. So the other side of South Main Street, including Cohasset Village. Just from the water going overland from the seaside. Assets exposed to flooding would include the Smith Place Pump Station, the MBTA Greenbush line around Spring Street, the US Post Office, the Elms Meadow Wells, which are a source of the town's potable water supply. And the incursion of seawater into that well field area could have a negative impact on water quality. We haven't evaluated, again, how soon that would happen. It might be sooner than what we're talking about here because of those hydraulic connections, right? So the connection between the lower Jacobs Meadow area and the areas upstream, if that is allowing seawater to go up and into that well field area longer, you could have more salinity building up over time. It's a problem that could be solved with engineering, but that also might have some unintended consequences by making it harder to drain the upstream areas in a flooding scenario. Emergency response from the police and fire station on Elm Street would be hampered as well by significant detours to reach most areas of town. Particularly those impacted by flooding. Just to put it out there, the fire station, the police station were built relatively high up. So even though they appear to be very close to the water, they were not found to be vulnerable in the scenario, nor is the public housing that's just north of it. So those are positive stories. did my otherwise very doomy presentation. And assuming none, I will move on unless there's a question in the audience. We got one.
Just maybe to follow up on a point
Sure.
Mike made earlier. So under these flooding scenarios, the most extreme point of vulnerability is, it sounds like going through the Gulf and Black Horse Lane, and water comes flowing into town across Black Horse Lane into Summer Street and towards St. Anthony's. And then secondarily at a certain level, then it can go over the cove in the Elm Street. But Black Horse Lane is the most vulnerable spot for flooding.
Yeah, it appears that way. Yeah, and I think that picture of Summer Street kind of showed that it's already something that can happen. The extent to which that just water going over Summer Street in that location causes massive flooding depends on how high off of it, how high above Summer Street it goes, because the higher it goes, the more volume of water can move in. And that's dependent on how big of a storm it is. So I would say that's true. That's definitely the case in the near term. In the long term, in the 2050 and 2070, we showed that, you know, there's a 50% chance of water going over either of those. So there's not really at that point a difference. And even in present day, the difference between the water level that causes water to go over Summer Street versus the difference between water going over the seawall at Cohasset Cove is pretty small. That's because we have a big tide range, so it takes a much bigger storm, you know, a much rarer storm to produce that extra difference. But over time, as sea level rises, it's not. I mean, if you only protected that one spot at Summer Street, you'd be leaving yourself open to something happening at Elm Street. So it is different. It's definitely a higher risk. But in terms of priority, it's probably, you know, maybe do both things if you can, or, you know, don't wait too long to do so.
This is Tom Bell.
I'm out.
Could
You're
you,
still in Zoom.
Montana.
I think you can hear me.
Oh,
Just close it, please.
Must have walked out of the.
No, I think you just closed.
I think you're still in because it says stop share.
Okay.
This is different. Yeah.
All right. I'll record this half of the presentation, half. Yeah. I'll record the rest of the presentation again if for some reason it stopped. All right. Well, I'm going to spend very little time on 2070. Part of the reason is that the well, I'll start. Let's just go through it. So these are the impacts for 2070. I guess what's not shown here is that in 2070, the 50% annual chance, or the every 2-year kind of flood levels are likely to have similar impacts to this 2050 1% levels I just showed you. So it becomes a bit moot to talk about the impacts because they're so extensive so frequently. But to be complete, they are the 10% flood levels are slightly higher than the 1% flood levels in 2050. The impacts to transportation assets would be more extensive. You can see most things are highlighted in red in this, including all of the commuter rail. I think that's one of the bigger differences, that in the 10% event here in 2070, you know, a large extent of the MBTA Greenbush line and Cushing Street end up being vulnerable. The South Shore Community Center is also notably vulnerable to flooding at this level. But due to the steep increases in topography kind of beyond the areas that are impacted, there's not much of a sort of horizontal expansion, like a spatial expansion in the floodplain in 2070 and the 10% and the 1%. But the difference is how deep the water gets, right? So in the 1% flooding would be very deep and longer lasting and more destructive, which I think came through in some of those maps that I presented earlier with 5 feet of flooding, you know, all over the place. All right, now want to just say that again, these projections, you know, are high sea level rise scenario. You know, the impacts could occur 20 years later in a intermediate, if we have intermediate sea level rise. So although the impacts are extensive, the risks are real. It's important to be still in a mindset of, you know, how do we address this incrementally? And I've heard a couple of comments and questions here that point to that, you know, where are the most important things that we need to do first to kind of reduce vulnerability. Are there any questions on 2070 before I move on? All right, I'm going to talk a little bit about tidal datum. So we projected future tidal datum based on dynamic modeling in the MCFRM model. So these are not just the addition of sea level rise to present day tidal datum. We've created this tidal datum for the 1999 to 2000, our baseline period, our 2008, our present day. And I wanted to also mention sort of mean higher high water, which is the MHHW, and mean lower low water. So those are kind of like the average upper and lower ends of our tide range. We have a diurnal tide cycle, so we have 2 high tides per day. The higher of those 2 tides is the higher tide, and the lower of those 2 is the lower tide. The average of all the lower tides in a given year, or in a 19-year period, or in a given year, would be the mean higher high water and the mean lower low water. So mean higher high water and mean high water are the important ones for understanding risk from high tide flooding when there's no storm. Sometimes it's called sunny day flooding because there's no storm. But other datum like mean low water are important for boating and for natural resources because those sometimes affect where things can grow or where you can navigate a boat. So the upside is you'll be able to navigate a lot better when sea level rises, right? Because you don't have to worry about dredging so frequently. So high tide flooding, thankfully, is not a major risk for the watershed in the near term. Again, beyond the watershed, some lower parts of Margin Street or Border Street, it could be, but we're focused here on this watershed. So there's already fringe flooding on Marginal Street and around Cohasset Cove, sometimes during like spring high tides or king tides. And those are kind of a period of time when because of the position of the moon and earth and the sun, there's higher tides than usual, even when there's no storm. And water levels can be 1 or 2 feet, 1 to 2 feet higher than the mean higher high water number. So I've highlighted 7.5 here, which is the 2050 mean higher high water. And wanted to show an example from the Boston Harbor tide gauge. So that is about the water level that was reached in January 2022. And this photo is taken at Margin Street around Stockbridge Street during that event. So you can see, you know, by 2050, the areas around Cohasset, around the James Brook watershed along the harbor could be experiencing daily high tide flooding. That does not extend to Summer Street, for example, that low point. That doesn't occur until 2070. So that 9.0 and 9.4, the mean high water and mean higher high water in 2070, that's when we expect the lower part of the watershed to start to be exposed to daily high tide flooding. And the impacts are likely similar to what we showed in the present day in that light green and yellow. So that 1% and the 0.5% annual chance. So we do show in that 0.5% chance water going over the seawall. Which is at about 9.1, so right on the fringe there. Because king tides are, you know, spring tides are up to 2 feet higher, that means that in 2050, we could have significant flooding during king tides as well. So there is a tide gate at the end of everybody familiar with the tide gate? There's a tide gate, the culvert, right? So all of the James Brook watershed is discharged to Cohasset Cove through a tide gate. It's 6 feet by 10 feet. And there's a culvert under Elm Street that leads to it. That tide gate does a couple of different things. It allows water to come in to Jacob's Meadow to help flush the salt marsh and creates habitat, creates better habitat for animals and plants, improves the marsh health, and it also improves water quality. The tide gate also serves flood control benefits. So obviously when it's closed, storm surge doesn't come through that tide gate and flood the areas around Jacob's Meadow. It has to go over Summer Street first, right? The tide gate also, when it's in storm mode, can be turned on before a big storm comes. And I think it's actually in storm mode right now because we've had some rainfall. And what that does is it basically takes advantage of any scenario where the tide is lower than Jacob's Meadow the water levels in Jacobs Meadow, it's gonna drain, right? So and then, you know, once tide levels reach higher, it closes it. So it prevents storms, it prevents tidal inflow during those periods and maximizes discharge. And when you turn it on before a storm, it has the effect of creating storage for that rainfall runoff that comes from the upper watershed into Jacobs Meadow. So it provides a number of flood control benefits. I should have mentioned that in terms of those ecological benefits, the way that it does that without causing properties to also flood is it has a set point at which above that level, the tide gate closes. So it prevents water in Jacobs Meadow from reaching so high that it floods a house, for example. But it's still on a normal situation allows water to come in and go out for the benefit of the ecology. So as we move forward, as that tide range creeps up, there's going to be an impact in terms of the flushing dynamics, right? So once water levels will reach kind of that threshold number under normal conditions, reach that threshold numbers earlier and then stay at that level. So there won't be as much water coming in. It'll kind of reach that period. And then after that, it will draw down until the point where the tide is higher than the bottom of kind of the culvert, the high point on that culvert. So the ecological benefits of it will be impacted over time. And it could reduce flushing in the long run. We're talking primarily about flooding, and the flood control benefits will be impacted as well. So as the gate is closed for more parts of the day, as the tide level is higher more often, the ability to draw down Jacobs Meadow in advance of a storm will be decreased. The likelihood that the peak rainfall runoff from the upper watershed syncs up with the tide, you know, that's too high for it to drain will increase. And there's also, as I mentioned previously, the risk of it being overtopped, right? In 2070, we know that high tide will be higher than the seawall. So water's gonna be coming in over this tide, over the seawall, and then presumably has to drain out through that, that culvert. So it'll be less useful in the future is the short story. Any questions on the tidal impacts? Just a bunch of sad faces here. Please, come on, a little chipper. Well, the next phase of our project is the exciting part, which is really focusing on solutions. And you know, sometimes people get not so happy with solutions too, but we'll get there. But there ought to be some solutions here that we can have for these challenges. So one kind of framework for thinking about risks, as I mentioned, is regional strategies. And when we're developing regional strategies, we like to really focus on flood pathways, right? So other parts of Cohasset even might be vulnerable across a really, really long shoreline, right? It just might be a big, low, you know, area. Parts of Boston, like South Boston, all really at the same elevation, very flat. So when water starts coming in one place, it's coming in from, you know, miles of waterfront. Flood pathways are when water's coming in through relatively narrow location. So if you can act on that location, you can prevent a bunch of risk inland from that. There's always a residual risk. There's always a chance that water levels are higher than that, but you have to live with some risk because we can't fully mitigate all risks. So one of the previous initiatives that the town had was to work with the Center for Coastal Studies to map flood pathways. And they didn't just focus on the ones along the waterline, along the shoreline, but also looking at low points, let's say on South Main Street. So how does water go from the lower watershed to the upper watershed? And they did this for both Cohasset and Scituate. And there were, I think, over 30 points that they located within the James Brook watershed. But in analyzing those alongside our model results, we found that essentially there are three key ones, three primary flood pathways, where water wants to first come over the shoreline and then affects a larger area. And over time, if you go out to 2070, they kind of bleed into each other a little bit, but these are kind of your first places to act, and I have them listed here in order of likelihood and timing. So again, in present day, it's kind of that 2% level, maybe somewhere between a 2 and 5. For the pathway on Elm Street, it's around between a 1% and so between a 100-year and 200-year event. And then relatively quite a bit higher than that is the one up here at Summer Street and Main Street and South Main Street. So, risk becomes, risk is relatively low compared to other places where I've worked, relatively low. A 50-year recurrence level is relatively low. It becomes pretty high in 2030 and very high in 2050. And our focus of this next phase of the project is really on what kind of engineering interventions, both gray strategies like raising a road or building some kind of wall, green strategies like helping to reduce, wave impacts or erosion to kind of bolster, seawalls in the inner harbor or otherwise, changes to the way the tide gate is operated, et cetera. And hybrid strategies, how can we use those strategies at more limited locations to cost effectively reduce risk in the large area. We're not specifically going to be evaluating, how many millions of dollars can we avoid in damages as part of this project. We thought about it, considered it, but we weren't able to do it within the time constraints of this project, but that's something that could be looked at in the future. So these strategies, while many private properties will benefit from the implementation of any of these strategies, it's still not cost effective to protect every single property in this way. So some properties could remain on the unprotected side of a flood barrier, right? It's also not possible, as I mentioned previously, to fully eliminate risk, both for critical assets potentially and also for private properties on the protected side of these barriers. And finally, there's a limit to how high we can build things like roads and seawalls, and what we can afford to build. So, as I mentioned earlier, one helpful strategy is to kind of proceed incrementally and to try to build in as much adaptability as you can as you go. So for example, if you're going to be rebuilding a seawall, rebuilding it with a foundation that supports raising it in the future by extra feet without having to rebuild the whole structure, right? So reducing your future cost, maybe spending a little bit more today, reducing your future cost and reducing the current impact on things like views, which, are important, and waterfront access and things like that. But kind of keeping your options open for the future when priorities might change and risk will change. So this diagram, so what we did was I wanted to start at kind of a conceptual level. So what we ought to do is to figure out, what is a reasonable, acceptable level of risk for us. And I don't want to presume to know that for the community. I don't even think we could get everybody in this room to agree on what that level should be. But we're living currently with a 2% risk level. So I said, let's start there. And let's say, well, we'd like to maintain our current risk, in perpetuity for the future. So this diagram kind of compares those flood elevations in those future time horizons at that 2% chance level with the low point on like the center line of the roads that I mentioned previously at those key locations, and also the low point on like Cohasset Cove at the seawall. And so you can see, in the near term, these flood elevations appear, fairly attainable. More evaluation needs to go into that, but the long-term ones point to kind of a very overwhelming feasibility challenge. So again, incremental improvements are recommended, tracking sea level rise as you go to make sure that you're not over designing or under preparing. And it could be that in the long run, people are more used to living with risk, living with water in a way that we adapted pretty quickly to a pandemic and changed our lifestyles and our habits. People are fairly flexible, and things may force us to be more so in the future. So I wanted to kind of share a sense of like the horizontal, area of potential intervention if you're trying to meet these levels. So to meet that 2030, and sorry, I want to go back 1 second quickly, just to say that at the Cohasset Cove seawall, we've incorporated also a significant wave height. So because you have waves there and you don't want waves rushing over so much that it's impacting transportation and people's property, et cetera, you need to build in that extra height to deal with the waves. We did not do that for the other locations. We could, but they're more inland. And if a little bit of water was splashing over in these locations, it wouldn't lead to flooding of the whole watershed. It would potentially lead to hazardous conditions on those particular locations of roadways. This is the solid lines in this are kind of where the existing ground elevations meet that level. So those are kind of like your tie-in locations. And then the dashed lines between them are kind of showing you where you might intervene, where you might raise a road or build a seawall or build some kind of berm or do some kind of, hybrid strategy that improves ecology while also providing flood protection. Yes.
Could you just maybe re-explain tie-in grade? I didn't quite follow.
Yeah, so that's where the existing ground is already at that level.
Okay,
Meaning if you can connect 2 points that are already at that level and do that again at locations 1, 2, and 3, your water's not coming over in that 2% event.
okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
So the dash lines are not meant to say that we're going to raise all these roadways or that that's where you need to act, but it's kind of showing you we need to connect from point A, high ground over here to high ground over here. And so it's not just like one really narrow point. You can see here that there's, pretty wide areas. They may not seem that wide, but once you start taking into account people's driveways and connecting people's front yards and, utilities that are underground, it's not as simple as just raising these roads, right? So some feasibility analysis would sort of be a next step for strategies that we end up evaluating in our next step of this project. So in our next task, we're going to be plugging some of these things into the model and then throwing at it, a 1% storm in 2030 and seeing, okay, is this working? Is it causing negative impacts somewhere else? And then the question is, well, what do we do at these locations? If we say raising grade will be how to do it, we can evaluate a bunch of different alternatives. Raising a road, incorporating walls, incorporating just ground that's vegetated, that's higher. So these are different types of strategies, and there could be private property impacts. I've tried to highlight locations within the right of way, within the town's existing property, where those high points are located. There could be shorter paths that cut through private property, right? So we're focused here on hopefully strategies that don't have those types of impacts, but once you start going higher, you tend to have to go further out. And so that's an issue. Also, if you were to raise a road, let's say here on Summer Street, close to South Main Street, you'd also have to taper back down, when you get to South Main Street from the side. So it's not showing you the full extent of where things would need to happen. It's just kind of, again, trying to identify general locations. In 2050, to meet the 2050 level, you can see we're almost going all the way through Summer Street from South Main to Elm Street and Margin. And in 2070, we basically get there. So there is some high ground on Summer Street where we don't have to do much, right? From here to here. And then the rest of this network is where you need to intervene. And finally, as that becomes, again, going back to that previous image where we showed, how high you need to potentially raise something like Summer Street at Elm Street, 4 feet or so, or at Black Horse Lane, almost probably 5 feet there. You start to think, well, is there another feasible way to do this? And the answer is there could be, and we could evaluate interventions that would be broader on the Gulf River. So because the Gulf River is the source of that flooding, this is again just kind of high level. The regulatory issues involved, the cost of doing so would be very high, but There are a couple of low-lying areas right as you go over the bridge, and then a little bit further down on Border Street. Where you could do an intervention that wouldn't impact as many private properties. You could potentially even also increase normal tidal flow. Because the culverts that are going through those areas are pretty small currently, so you could potentially have some more ecological benefits of greater tidal flushing up to a point. And then the bridges, there's 2 existing bridges where you could theoretically, if you were reconstructing those bridges, incorporate some kind of tide gate below it that would prevent water from coming up or down. The effectiveness of this is something that we could model fairly easily, just to see, do we need to do the tide gate at both of those bridges or just one of them? But again, this is not like a solution to sea level rise. As we saw previously, 9 feet, 9.4 feet of just normal tidal cycle, you'd be flooding over the road. So this type of tide gate would only be used, in a very extreme event. And then under normal conditions, you would still be maybe raising Summer Street a portion to prevent kind of small storms and daily tidal flooding from impacting the watershed. But again, very high level, big challenge to permit and very costly. Yes.
I'm confused on the flood pathways.
Sure.
Which way the water is moving.
Mhm.
So I think what I've been following, I thought, was seawater. And you mentioned Gulf, the Gulf is a place where that's the source of a lot of flooding. So if seawater is coming from the bay under the Border Street Bridge and then around Supper Island along Black Horse Lane to Summer Street.
Yeah.
Is that the movement of the water that you're thinking of?
Yes, it is. Yes.
Okay, so then,
My concern with this one was just that as you start to look down, towards in Situate, as you kind of zoom out in your map, you start to see that there's a, shallow, relatively low barrier beach. That's the only thing preventing water from coming in the other direction. And there could be flooding
so you're thinking
in the long term.
the
from the other side.
Squashpit Pond, that seawater would come over the berm on the seaward side of the pond?
No, sir, so sorry to interrupt. I'm gonna have to pass the Zoom off to my boss at 7:30. We can keep the presentation up.
That's okay.
We don't have to dwell on it.
That's fine.
Sorry.
Yeah, this is really the end. I'll just jump to next steps and just say that. If you have feedback, now here at the end of the presentation, I'll just open it up for that. Next steps I've kind of already outlined, and there will be another public meeting to discuss this. So I guess opening up now to just any thoughts about either what you've heard, your level of comfort, discomfort, strategies, etc. Yes, there's one in the back.
This is excellent. Thank you very much. It essentially is a updated 2023 version of what Tom Bell and others in this room presented to us. So that what you're talking about here is no surprise to us. My question is, are you going to come up with specific recommendations for how Cohasset can protect itself?
Yes.
Good.
Yes.
I'll come back to that meeting.
Sounds good. Yeah, so step 1 was vulnerability assessment, understand what's at risk. Is there a call for action? How soon? And then the next step is, well, what should we do about it? And then comparing how effective those different strategies are and the feasibility of them and what they might look like is the next step. After that, there's still engineering design, permitting, fundraising, all those aspects of doing something that go from this initial step. Yes. Oh, sorry. One over here and then to you in the order.
Can you go back to your 2030 slide that was,
This one?
okay. So, suggestion to look at. Up at the intersection of Elm Street and Martin Street. The elevation on the road was already at 213. Where the little driveway cuts across between Summer Street and Border Street, where you've got your solid yellow line. There's an elevation 13 in there. If you connect those two, you've got a dike across the entire section that would flood Elm Street. Likewise, down here on Black Horse Lane, there's a private driveway that goes across to the high ground at the end of that little pointy section of the Gulf.
And here, this one,
No,
or the
down,
one
down,
down,
down to the right, to the right,
the right.
down.
Oh, here,
Right
this,
there,
yeah,
that driveway.
right. Yeah, I've looked at that location because that was of interest to me.
At the end of the driveway, that's all high ground.
Yeah,
At the intersection of Black Horse Lane, that's all high ground there. You raise the entire driveway to elevation 13 and you've now got another dike.
yeah, the challenge there is just that it sort of stops there. It doesn't,
No, but you can.
What I
cross-
mean is-
You can cross right through there, right there.
from here to here.
Yeah, so
Yeah.
you raise Black Horse Lane and you raise raise that little piece of Black Horse Lane and you raise the driveway, and that's a dike. You don't have to do anything with Summer Street. Protects all those houses on Summer Street relative to driveway elevations, front door elevations, all that business. The same thing is true up at Martin and Border Street. Border Street's mostly at elevation 8. And when you get to Cove, it's also at elevation 8. So
So you're saying here, between here, high ground here and
straight down.
and
right
here. Yes, that's what these dashes look like. Okay, so either along the shoreline or
there.
inland.
It's connecting the high ground. There's
Yeah.
high ground from
Exactly.
basically Martin Street all the way down here to Cedar.
Yeah, this first pass was really thinking about it within footprint of public infrastructure, but we can certainly take a look at other options that involve private property. So yeah, we'll take that into account for Black Horse Lane, that area. There's a lot of environmental resources in there, which will make it challenging, but sorry. Oh, yeah, we got
No, I'll bring up the
can keep
presentation.
talking.
Yeah. Sorry to everyone on Zoom. I gotta log you off.
At some point, I guess we're gonna have to understand what the trade-offs are, environmental resources.
Thank you,
of other
everyone.
towns. So